Welcome to Aegis Report, your premier source for tactical intelligence and high-stakes geopolitical analysis, where today we are dissecting the total structural disintegration of the Iranian state and the silent military coup currently paralyzing Tehran. The resignation of Parliament Speaker Mohammad Baqer Qalibaf is not merely a political shift. It represents the final collapse of the bridge between Iran's pragmatic civilian wing and the ideologically rigid paramilitary apparatus of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Qalibaf, a former IRGC commander himself, was the only figure capable of navigating the treacherous waters between the hardliners in the barracks and the international negotiators in Islamabad, and his sudden departure signals that the diplomatic door has been slammed shut from the inside. We are witnessing a regime in terminal decline, where the traditional levers of statecraft have been replaced by a raw, unadulterated military council that prioritizes its own survival over the survival of the nation. As we peel back the layers of this intelligence bomb, it becomes clear that the IRGC has decided that peace is a greater threat to their domestic economic empire than total international isolation or even a full-scale kinetic conflict with the West. The strategic vacuum left by Qalibaf's exit has been immediately filled by a shadow cabinet of IRGC loyalists who have successfully placed President Mohammad Pezeshkian under a form of functional house arrest, stripping him of his ability to appoint intelligence ministers or even communicate with the Supreme Leader's office. This internal power grab is being spearheaded by IRGC Commander-in-Chief Ahmad Vahidi, a man whose presence on the Interpol Red Notice list for the 1994 AMIA bombing underscores the shift from state-led diplomacy to terrorism as policy. Vahidi's objective is clear: to purge any individual willing to entertain a nuclear compromise or an economic off-ramp, thereby ensuring that the perpetual war state remains the only viable framework for Iranian governance. The civilian government is now a decorative shell, an empty facade used to issue dictated social media posts, while the real decisions regarding the Strait of Hormuz and the national budget are made in secure bunkers far removed from the public eye. This is a regime that has ceased to function as a sovereign state and has instead transformed into a paramilitary conglomerate holding 92 million people hostage for the sake of its own financial and ideological preservation. The economic fallout from this internal coup is nothing short of catastrophic, with the Iranian rial entering a terminal death spiral that has seen it lose 60% of its value in just a few months, now trading at a staggering 1.32 million per US dollar. The International Monetary Fund's estimate of 69% inflation is likely a conservative figure, as the middle class in Tehran and beyond is being systematically wiped out by a cost-of-living crisis that has no historical parallel in the modern Middle East. While the people starve, the IRGC continues to funnel the nation's dwindling foreign reserves into its proxy networks across Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq, prioritizing the regional shadow play over the basic caloric intake of its own citizens. This decoupling of the regime's interests from the welfare of the populace has created a high-pressure social environment similar to the one that preceded the 2022 and 2025 uprisings. But this time, the state's ability to buy loyalty through subsidies has been completely evaporated by the U.S.-led maritime blockade. We are watching the slow-motion implosion of a central bank that can no longer intervene to save its currency, led by a president who cannot even access the data required to manage the crisis. The United States has responded to this internal fracture with a strategy of ironclad strangulation, an economic siege so precise that it is draining the regime of $500 million every single day without the need for a single airstrike. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's directive of "nothing in, nothing out" has effectively turned the Iranian coastline into a commercial graveyard, where Karg Island's oil storage facilities are reaching their absolute physical limits. When an oil well is shut in due to a lack of storage, the geological and technical damage is often permanent, meaning the IRGC is physically destroying Iran's future productive capacity just to survive the current 30-day tactical window. The Trump administration's decision to maintain this blockade while extending the diplomatic deadline was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, forcing the IRGC to choose between a humiliating surrender and a self-destructive escalation. By squeezing the Chinese banking lifelines that previously allowed for gray market oil sales, the U.S. Treasury has pushed the Tehran regime against a balance of payments wall that they cannot climb, regardless of how many missiles they parade through the streets. The global energy market is now the primary battlefield for this confrontation, as the IRGC's decision to reimpose the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz has removed 10 million barrels of oil per day from the global supply chain almost overnight. This massive supply shock has sent Brent crude surging past $120 per barrel, creating a domino effect that is currently being felt at every gas station from Kansas to Karachi. The maritime blockade has also triggered a severe food security crisis in the Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their food imports, forcing regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to rethink their strategic neutrality. When Qatar Energy was forced to declare force majeure on its LNG exports, the shockwaves hit the European Central Bank and the Fed, halting planned interest rate cuts and placing the entire Western economy on a recessionary footing. This is exactly what the IRGC wants: to hold the global economy hostage in hopes that the resulting international pressure will force the United States to blink and lift the blockade without requiring any concessions from Tehran. Inside the corridors of power in Tehran, the Vahidi Protocol has effectively established a military cordon around the new Supreme Leader's office, preventing even the most senior civilian officials from delivering objective intelligence reports on the state of the nation. Reports indicate that Moshaba Khamenei is being kept in a state of strategic isolation, receiving only curated data that supports the IRGC's narrative of military readiness and impending Western collapse. This information blockade ensures that the highest levels of the theocratic regime are operating on a set of hallucinations, disconnected from the reality of the oil well shut-ins and the collapsing rial. By controlling the flow of information to the leadership, the IRGC commanders have ensured that no one in the room can challenge their suicidal path, creating a feedback loop of radicalization that makes a black swan military escalation almost inevitable. The shadow play of hidden agendas has now fully consumed the kinetic event of actual governance, leaving the country adrift in a storm of its own making, while the men in uniform tighten their grip on the rudder. The strategic motive behind this internal sabotage is the preservation of the IRGC's massive economic empire, specifically the Khatam al-Anbiya conglomerate, which controls the vast majority of Iran's infrastructure and telecommunications projects. For the IRGC, peace is a terminal threat because a normalized Iranian economy would require transparency, civilian oversight, and a redirection of funds from the military budget to the public sector. A state of perpetual war allows the IRGC to justify its monopolies, its surveillance state, and its bypass of the traditional legal framework under the guise of national security. They are not sabotaging the peace talks because they hate the West, though they do. They are sabotaging the peace talks because they cannot afford the civilian oversight that peace would bring. The resignation of Qalibaf was a tactical move to remove a man who understood where the money was buried and who might have been willing to trade IRGC assets for a lifting of the blockade. With him gone, the military has ensured that the cash cow of the Iranian state remains firmly under their control, even if that cow is currently starving to death. As we look toward the next 30 days, the Aegis analyst view identifies three distinct paths for this cornered regime, the most likely of which is the controlled implosion. In this scenario, the IRGC completes its transition to a full-blown military junta, discarding the remaining pretenses of the 1979 Constitution and ruling through a combination of digital censorship and raw kinetic force. They will likely replace the negotiating team with ultra-hardliners like Saeed Jalili, whose reputation for stalling as strategy will be used to buy a few more months of time, while they attempt to find new ways to bypass the maritime blockade. However, this path is exceptionally brittle. The IRGC's own rank-and-file soldiers are starting to feel the sting of the Rial's collapse, and an unpaid security force is rarely a loyal one. If the salaries stop arriving in May 2026, the very men tasked with crushing the protests may find themselves joining the crowds, a realization that has likely led to the current atmosphere of panicked power consolidation among the top brass in Tehran. The second, more dangerous scenario is the catastrophic gamble, where the IRGC, realizing that their economic time has run out, decides to lash out at the United States' regional partners to force a global intervention. This could involve direct missile strikes on desalination plants in the UAE or more aggressive seizures of commercial tankers belonging to non-aligned nations like India or Switzerland. By attacking bystanders, Tehran hopes to create a global chorus of peace at any price that would break the back of the US-led blockade. However, this gamble ignores the new reality of the Trump administration's Ironclad policy, which treats any such escalation as a justification for further economic and cyber retaliation rather than a prompt for diplomatic retreat. The IRGC is playing a high-stakes game of poker with a hand that has already been revealed, and their attempt to use the global oil market as a hostage is only serving to unify the international community against their continued grip on the Iranian state. The third and final scenario is the total systemic collapse, where the internal fractures between the IRGC and the regular military, or between competing factions within the IRGC itself, lead to a localized civil war within the capital. The recent failed attempts by President Pezeshkian to appoint an intelligence minister suggest that there are still pockets of resistance within the bureaucracy that are unwilling to follow Vahidi into the abyss. If these factions find a way to coordinate with the growing protest movement in the streets, the resulting geopolitical earthquake would reshape the Middle East for a generation. The 1979 regime was built on a foundation of clerical legitimacy and oil wealth, both of which have now been completely eroded, leaving only the scaffolding of the IRGC to hold the structure upright. When that scaffolding buckles under the weight of a 68% inflation rate and a total maritime siege, the resulting fall will be felt in every capital from Washington to Beijing, marking the definitive end of the era of the Islamic Republic. We must also consider the nuclear dash, which represents the ultimate suicide pill for the IRGC leadership as they find themselves increasingly backed into a corner by the Trump blockade. Intelligence suggests that the hardline faction sees a nuclear weapon not as a tool for war, but as a regime insurance policy that would prevent any external attempt at regime change or further economic strangulation. The removal of Qalibaf, who was open to discussing the nuclear file as part of a grand bargain, suggests that the IRGC has already decided to move the enriched uranium stockpile to more secure, deeper underground facilities in preparation for a final breakout. This move would trigger an immediate and massive kinetic response from Israel and potentially the United States, turning the shadow play into a hot war that would consume the entire region. The Aegis V5 protocol identifies this as the highest risk factor in the next 90 days, as a regime that feels it has nothing left to lose is a regime that will reach for the ultimate leverage point, The impact on the Western consumer cannot be overstated, as the struggle for power in Tehran is the direct cause of the current $4 a gallon gas reality and the rising grocery bills across the EU and North America. Every interest rate decision made by the European Central Bank is currently a response to the energy tax being imposed on the world by a handful of Iranian generals who refuse to let go of their monopolies. The volatility in the oil market is not a byproduct of war. It is the primary weapon of the IRGC, used to exert pressure on the West in a way that conventional military strikes never could. For the average citizen in the West, the silent coup in Tehran is not a distant geopolitical curiosity. It is a direct assault on their retirement accounts, their mortgage rates, and their standard of living. This is the true nature of modern geopolitical warfare. A local power struggle in a single capital can be leveraged to destabilize the global financial order, proving that in 2026 there are no isolated conflicts. Looking at the broader Middle East, the IRGC's power grab has fundamentally altered the security architecture of the region, pushing former rivals into an uneasy alliance against the Tehran implosion. Sunni Gulf states that were once hesitant to fully align with U.S.-led pressure are now the primary victims of the IRGC's tanker war, leading to a level of intelligence sharing and maritime coordination that was unthinkable just 5 years ago. The Ironclad blockade is only possible because the regional partners are now convinced that the IRGC is a greater threat to their stability than the prospect of a regime collapse in Iran. This shift in regional dynamics has left the IRGC more isolated than at any point in its history, with its only remaining lifelines being the increasingly hesitant support of a few Chinese banks and its own dwindling domestic reserves. The Vahidi Protocol has succeeded in consolidating power at home, but it has done so by burning every bridge that could have provided a way out of the current crisis. The Iranian people, meanwhile, are trapped in a vice between a regime that sees them as human shields and a blockade that sees them as a pressure point for change. The IRGC's refusal to allow internet access or provide accurate economic data is a clear sign that they fear their own population more than they fear the U.S. Navy. The memory of the 2022 and 2025 protests still haunts the corridors of the Evin prison, and the regime knows that it cannot survive another nationwide uprising if the security forces are not fully committed to the massacre. By militarizing the government and sidelining the pragmatists, the IRGC is betting that a more brutal, modesty-focused, and Islamic anime-style crackdown will be enough to keep the lid on the boiling pot of Iranian society. However, history teaches us that when the sovereign script of a regime becomes this disconnected from the material reality of its people, the script is usually in its final act, regardless of how many generals are holding the pens. In conclusion, the resignation of Mohammad Baqer Qalibaf and the subsequent military consolidation in Tehran mark the beginning of the end for the Islamic Republic of Iran, as it has been known for the past 47 years. The clerical state has been consumed by its own paramilitary shadow, and the resulting military junta is now steering the country toward a choice between total economic surrender or catastrophic regional escalation. For the Aegis Report audience, the message is clear. The volatility in the energy markets and the tension in the Strait of Hormuz are not going to subside until the structural crisis in Tehran is resolved, one way or the other. We are watching the collapse of a regional power in real time, an event that will redefine the global order and the energy security of the West for the next decade. This has been an Aegis V5 Special Intelligence Briefing. Stay tuned as we continue to track the domino effect of the Tehran implosion and the final moves of a cornered regime.